I still remember the sound the last crate made when the clerk dragged it across the floor and marked it sold. It was not a grand sound, not the kind a man expects to hear at the ending of his old life. It was a small, mean scraping of wood on wood in a hot river town where no one paused for our ruin. Men kept talking on the boardwalk. A dray rolled past outside. Somebody laughed in the alley beside the warehouse. And there I stood, Sam Hale, watching the last of what had once looked like a respectable business leave my hands for less than it had cost me to believe in it. By then, Lydia and I had sold nearly everything worth naming. The mule team went first because sound animals still brought cash. Then the harness, the spare tools, the better stove, my weighing scale, the walnut table Lydia had polished every Saturday, 2 chairs, 3 quilts, a trunk of winter clothes, and the shelf I had built with such care I once thought it proved I was becoming a settled man. The room grew emptier by the day. Pale marks showed on the floor where furniture had stood. Dust gathered in corners that had never seen light before. What remained looked ashamed to still belong to us. The trading venture had failed in the ugliest way possible. Not all at once, but a little at a time. One load of produce sat too long in the heat and spoiled under canvas. A shipment of smoked fish arrived late and soft. The river dropped when I needed it high, then rose when I needed the landing clear. A man I had trusted on credit folded before paying me. My partner, who had spoken bravely when we began, withdrew what little ready cash remained and called the rest bad luck, which is what men say when they want ruin to sound accidental. I blamed weather in public. In private, I blamed myself. Lydia never once said I had been foolish. That mercy stung worse than blame would have. She tied up her sleeves, sorted what could be sold from what must be kept, and moved through those last days with a calm I did not understand until much later. She did not waste tears on things already gone. She folded her seed packets into cloth. She wrapped the iron kettle in an old blanket. She set aside the auger, the hatchet, the draw knife, and the little coffee mill with the cracked handle. "We are not dead," she said to me one evening when I was staring at the naked walls. "So stop looking at this room like it buried us." The island came to us, as desperate land always does, in the careless mouth of a man who did not want it. A Marsh hay cutter told me about it behind the feed store while we settled the last small debt I owed him. "A forgotten patch among back channels and reeds," he said. "No proper road, no close neighbors, too wet for decent farming, too far for ordinary trade, too poor to tempt anybody with sense. That was why the land cost almost nothing." I remember going home under a sky white with heat, rehearsing how I would tell Lydia that our future had narrowed to a place people joked about. She was sitting on the floor because we had already sold the table. I told her everything at once: the price, the distance, the marsh water, the loneliness of it, the fact that no one wanted it. She listened with her hands folded around one knee, her face unreadable in the dim light. "How far from town?" she asked. I told her. "Far enough that no one goes there unless they mean to." She nodded and looked toward the open door where the evening glare lay across the threshold. "Good," she said. "Then the talk won't follow us." That was Lydia all over. I wanted land, she wanted silence. We left 2 mornings later in a borrowed skiff loaded so low I feared every wake would drown us. Heat rose off the water before noon. Gnats found our eyes and ears. The channels twisted through sawgrass and reeds taller than a man's stand. Mudbanks shone black under the sun. Turtles slid from logs. Once, a heron burst out of the cattails so suddenly Lydia gripped my arm, then laughed in spite of herself. I held on to that laugh. It was the first hopeful sound I had heard from either of us in weeks. Still, when the island finally showed itself through a stand of crooked willow, my heart sank. It was not a place waiting to receive us. It was a place half forsaken already. The old shed stood listing on one side of a patch of sour ground, its roof broken through, boards black with rot, one hinge hanging loose as a dead thing. I put my boot against a sill beam, and the wood gave way under hardly any pressure at all. The well was worse. It sat inland under scrub and vine, ringed with loose stones, half choked with leaves and stagnant dark. I dropped a pebble and heard no honest splash, only a dull sound down below and the smell of old water gone bad. I stood there with sweat running under my shirt and thought I had done it again. Another bargain, another mistake. Only this time I had carried Lydia with me to the end of it. "I have ruined us proper now," I said. She did not answer. She had turned toward the shore, squinting through the reeds at something I had taken for drift. Then she stepped forward, pushed aside a screen of marsh grass, and laid her hand on the weathered curve of an old fishing boat hull washed up long ago above the mudline. It was battered, gray, and stove in near the stern. No mast, no fittings, no paint worth speaking of. To me, it was just one more dead thing the Marsh had coughed onto shore. Lydia walked the length of it slowly, studying the planks, the shape, the strength still left in the ribs. At last, she looked back at me with that narrow, practical light in her eyes. "Sam," she said, "this is not junk." She pressed her palm against the hull again and smiled, tired but certain. "It is the first roof we own." I said nothing after that, because once Lydia saw a use in a broken thing, argument seldom survived her long. She walked the length of that old hull with one hand on the planks, feeling for soft places, studying the curve of it, the split near the stern, the ribs still holding true beneath the weathered skin. The marsh light shone silver on the gray wood. Gnats circled her face. Sweat ran down the side of her neck and vanished under her collar. Still, she looked less tired than intent, and there is a difference between those two states I did not understand then as well as I do now. "We drag it above the wet ground," she said. "Turn it over, set it on a frame, patch what we can patch. Live under it while we build the rest." I stared at the wreck, then at the island around us, all rot, reeds, standing water, and heat. "With what team?" I asked. "With what money?" "With our backs," she said, "and with the sense God left us." There are times in a man's life when pride deserts him cleanly, and there are times when it stays only long enough to be of no further use. I had already lost the town, the venture, the shelves I had built, the stove I had meant to grow old beside. I was not eager to lose my remaining dignity wrestling drifted lumber in a swamp. But Lydia had already knelt beside the hull and cleared away grass from the lower edge with both hands. If I had learned anything in those years, it was that standing still while my wife worked was the one shame I could not bear. So we unloaded the skiff first and carried what little we had to the driest patch of ground near the ruined shed. 2 trunks, a kettle, tools wrapped in canvas, flour, salt, Lydia's seed cloth, a pair of blankets. Every trip sank my boots deeper in the black mud. Marsh water seeped over the tops and cooled my socks for one blessed second before warming again. The air smelled of salt rot, hot reeds, and the sour breath of the useless well. By the time we finished, my shirt clung to me so tightly I could have wrung it out. Then we went back for the hull. The first mistake was trying to lift before we understood how the mud held it. I set my shoulder to one side while Lydia braced a cedar pole beneath the stern. "Now," I said, and we heaved like fools. The hull did not move. It only gave a faint, sucking groan from underneath, as if the shore itself had teeth in it. On the second try, the pole slipped, Lydia lost her footing, and I caught the full strain in my arms so suddenly I thought something had torn in my shoulder. I sat down hard in the reeds with mud up my sleeves and heard Lydia begin to laugh. I nearly took offense until I looked at her properly. She was laughing because if she did not, she might cry. So I laughed too, though there was little joy in it. "All right," she said, pushing wet hair back from her face. "Not like that." We stood over the boat and made ourselves think. That was always when we did our best work, after the first bad attempt had burned off whatever foolishness we started with. The hull was too heavy to drag naked through mud, and the ground beneath it too soft to give us any purchase. What we needed was lift, then rolling, then firmer footing farther inland. I went to the old shed and pried loose what timber I could salvage without having the whole rotten carcass collapse on me. Most of it was useless. A few short boards held. One beam, black on the outside and sound at the heart, came free after 10 stubborn minutes with the hatchet and my boot heel. Lydia found a coil of half-rotten rope buried under reeds and worked at the knots until enough of it proved strong to risk. By dusk, we had 2 lever poles, 3 rough rollers cut from young cedar, and a plan that at least respected the weight of what we meant to move. We slept that first night on blankets spread under the open sky beside our trunks, listening to frogs thrum in the channels and insects whine around our ears. Mosquitoes found every inch of me they could reach. The stars above the marsh looked hard and pitiless. Lydia lay on her back with one arm over her eyes. "We still have a roof," she said into the dark. "We have the idea of one." "That is more than we had yesterday." The next morning we started before the heat had fully gathered. I jammed the beam under the stern while Lydia packed broken boards and driftwood beneath it the instant it rose. We lifted a finger's breadth at a time, nothing more. The hull groaned. Mud sucked and released in wet kisses. Once a crab shot out from under the keel, and Lydia startled so badly she dropped her end and sent me backward into the muck. She apologized without much sincerity. By noon, we had the stern high enough to force the first roller under. That one roller changed the whole day. The boat moved barely the length of my hand on the first push, but it moved. After that, we learned the rhythm of it. Lever, block, shove, curse, reset the roller, drag the rear one forward, then do it again. Across every soft patch, we laid boards and brush to keep the logs from sinking. When the bow drifted crooked, Lydia corrected it with the rope while I pushed from behind. When one roller shot sideways and nearly took my ankle with it, we lost 10 good minutes to silence and breathing. By afternoon, my palms had opened in 2 places. Mud dried on my shins and cracked when I bent. Lydia's dress was streaked black to the knees. Neither of us suggested stopping. At sundown, the hull stood only 30 yards from where we had found it. Yet those 30 yards felt larger to me than the whole river town we had left. I put my hand on the weathered plank and felt, for the first time since our ruin, that we were not merely enduring hardship. We were altering. Lydia looked inland toward the strip of higher ground beyond the shed and the bruised clouds gathering low in the west. "We have 3 days," she said quietly. "For what?" "For the storm to find out whether we mean this." The clouds Lydia had seen were no fancy of hers. By dawn the next morning, they had thickened over the marsh in a long, dark shelf, and the air felt wrong. Still hot, still wet, but waiting. Even the birds seemed quieter. We set to work before breakfast and did not stop except to drink and curse and begin again. The hull had to reach the higher strip beyond the shed before the ground softened under rain, or all the labor already spent on it would sink back into mud. That day taught me the difference between dragging a thing and guiding it. The first 30 yards had been brute work. The next required judgment. The ground rose a little, then dipped in a black trough, slick with standing water. I thought we could push straight through it if we... Lydia said no. We argued, tired and sharp. I hated that she was right because I knew it even while I spoke. I tried my way first. The front roller vanished almost to its middle, the hull listed, and one whole side slid off the line we had marked with stakes. We lost an hour and nearly lost our tempers for good. Lydia stood with both hands on her hips, mud up to her calves. "You done proving it?" I wiped my face and spat black water. "I'm done." We backed it out inch by inch, cut a new path to the left where the sedge grew thicker, and built a firmer bed with saplings laid crosswise over brush. After that, the work went better. Not easier, better. There is a great comfort in obeying what the land tells you instead of insisting it behave like a floor in town. By noon, we had the hull clear of the worst muck and nearer the rise where a line of cedar roots held the soil tighter. Then the second mistake found us. We had meant to turn the boat over only after moving it to the exact spot. Once we reached the rise, I wedged my lever too deep and lifted too high, while Lydia pulled on the rope to straighten the bow. The hull rolled before either of us was ready. It came over with a hollow thump that shook the ground and trapped the rope beneath one side. If Lydia had been half a step slower, it might have pinned her leg. She went white, then angry, which in her case was the safer state. "Next time," she said through her teeth, "warn me before you wrestle the whole Atlantic." I could only nod. My mouth had gone dry. Oddly enough, that blunder saved time. The hull lay upside down now, its shape plain and useful at last, broad enough to shed rain if we could get it raised and steadied. So we quit aiming for perfection and settled for sufficiency, which is how many good frontier decisions were made. We chose a patch of firmest ground on the rise and marked 4 corners for a frame. From the shed ruins, I salvaged 2 more short beams. We cut young pine and cedar for skids and braces, stripped bark where it would hold damp, and dug shallow post beds with the spade and our hands where roots blocked the blade. The frame went together badly at first. One side sat higher, and when we tried to lever the hull onto it, the whole thing slipped, dropping the bow so hard one of the crosspieces split with a sound like a gunshot. I remember closing my eyes at that. Rain smell had come into the air by then, sharp and metallic. The clouds had lowered. Mosquitoes vanished as if they knew what was coming. Lydia crouched beside the broken timber, ran her thumb over the split, and said, "Not broken beyond use." That sentence became the creed of our first year. We sistered the cracked piece with a shorter beam, lashed and nailed it, then drove 2 forked posts deeper on the low side. After that, we lifted in stages, blocking the hull with chunks of wood each time it rose. I pushed with my shoulder under the curve while Lydia worked the lever and shoved braces into place. Once the hull slipped back and skinned both my hands. Once, a brace kicked loose and caught Lydia above the ankle hard enough to leave a bruise that lasted a week. Once, I thought we had no chance of finishing before rain. But toward evening, with the western sky gone greenish and the reeds bending under the first long breaths of storm wind, the hull settled down onto the frame and held. I cannot explain what relief feels like when it arrives in the middle of exhaustion. It is not joy at first, it is weakness. My knees nearly gave under me. No time for that, though. We still had cracks to seal. From the wrecked stern, we pried free scraps of old pitch where sun had not ruined it entirely, softened them in the kettle over a quick fire, and mixed in resin I had cut from the pines along the rise. It was poor stuff, smoky and uneven, but it filled seams. Lydia stuffed the wider gaps with moss and dry grass first. Then I smeared the black pitch over it with a broken board. By dark, our hands were black to the wrists, and the storm was on us proper. Rain struck the hull like thrown pebbles, then harder, then with force enough to blur all other sound. We crawled underneath with the blankets, the trunks, the tools, and the kettle, and sat there in that low, dim space, smelling wet wood, pitch, mud, and fear. Wind shoved at the hull. Water found two seams and dripped cold on my shoulder. Somewhere outside, one loose board from the old shed went flying. Lydia reached across the dark and took my hand as the whole roof shuddered once above us. Neither of us spoke for a long while. At last she whispered, "Still here." I listened to the rain hammering the boat that had become our roof and answered, "Yes, still here." Morning came gray and close, with rain still dripping from the lip of the hull in slow, fat drops. I woke, cramped, damp, clear through, and for one confused second I thought we were back in town under some leaking warehouse roof, waiting on a shipment that would not pay. Then I smelled pitch, marsh mud, wet cedar, and Lydia's hair where it had fallen against my shoulder, and I remembered where we were. More than that, I understood something I had not understood the day before. The storm had struck us with everything the island had ready, and still the roof stood. That discovery did not make the morning cheerful. It made it busy. The ground around the frame had turned to black paste. One brace had shifted. Water had crept in under the trunks. Our blankets smelled like a pond bank. When I crawled out, my knees sank at once, and the world beyond the hull looked washed raw. Reeds bent under the weight of water. The ruined shed had slumped farther to one side. A board from its roof lay half buried in muck 20 feet away. The sky was still low, the heat hiding behind the rain, waiting to rise again. Lydia came out after me, stood with her hands on her hips, and studied the shelter the way some women might study a newborn calf after a hard night. "Well," she said, "it kept out the sky." I laughed harder than the remark deserved. Relief does that to a man. It loosens him from the inside. We spent that day proving the roof had not saved us by accident. I reset the shifted brace and sank the forked posts deeper, packing clay and gravel hard around them with the back of the spade. Lydia crawled along the lower edge of the hull with a bucket of our foul black pitch, working moss into every seam that had wept in the night. Where the drip had struck my shoulder, she sealed it thick enough to stop a musket ball. Then we went after dryness itself, because that was the true work before us. A roof alone is only mercy for an hour. To live under it, we needed a floor, walls, and some answer to water that did not come from that dead well inland. The floor came first. I tore what decent boards I could from the shed and planed the worst splinters off with my knife. There were not enough, not nearly, so I cut straight saplings, laid them close across stones and short blocks, and made a sleeping platform high enough to keep our bedrolls out of the mud. It looked poor and felt glorious. Lydia spread one blanket over it and set the trunks at the head like furniture in a proper room. I remember standing back, muddy to the elbows, and seeing not comfort exactly, but arrangement. That matters more than town people suppose. A life begins to steady itself once its few possessions know where they belong. The walls were harder. We had no lumber to spare and no money for any, so we built them the way desperate people build many things, out of what the land would surrender if asked often enough. I drove short stakes around the frame, and Lydia wove reed bundles and willow switches between them until a rough skin rose on 3 sides beneath the hull. We packed grass, moss, and handfuls of clay into the weave, not to make it handsome, only to slow the wind and keep the rain from passing clean through. By midday, the sun returned with a vengeance. Steam lifted off the ground. Mosquitoes hatched from every puddle at once, or so it seemed. Sweat ran into my eyes and turned the clay on my hands slick as grease. Lydia's face reddened. Her sleeves stayed wet to the shoulder. Still, she worked as steadily as a loom. That afternoon, we made our first hard accounting of provisions. Flour enough for perhaps 3 weeks if stretched. Salt pork already softening in the damp heat. Coffee for 10 days. Cornmeal, beans, a little molasses, and less patience than any good household should depend on. Lydia sliced the pork, rubbed it again with salt, and hung it in the highest, driest place we had beneath the hall, though dry was an ambitious word for our condition. "We'll lose food before we lose courage," she said, "so we had better get ahead of the first one." She was right. Hunger on the frontier seldom arrived with drama. It crept in by spoilage, by damp, by mice, by one careless afternoon. Near evening, I went again to the well, more from stubbornness than hope. I cleared away vine and loose stone, lowered the bucket on our rope, and brought up a slurry that smelled of rot and iron. Even boiled, it would have poisoned us, or made us wish it had. I stood there, staring down into that useless dark, angry enough to kick the rim loose. Lydia came up behind me, carrying the kettle. "Leave it," she said. "It's the only well we have." "No," she answered, and pointed to the rim of the hull, where the morning rain had run in clear lines from bow to stern. "That is." We spent the last light rigging our first catchment. A split board under the lower edge, a strip of canvas to guide the runoff, the kettle beneath. It was crude and ugly, but when the next shower came, brief and warm at dusk, the water drummed down that board and filled the bottom of the pot clean as any blessing. I held up a cup to Lydia, and she drank with both hands around it, smiling over the rim. That night, under our patched roof and behind our reed walls, with frogs calling in the channels and the smell of wet earth all around us, I felt something shift inside me. Bankruptcy had driven us here. Mud had welcomed us. But for the first time since the trading venture failed, I was not thinking about what we had lost in town. I was thinking about what we had managed to keep standing for one more day. We stayed because staying began to seem easier than failing again somewhere else. That was the plain truth. Each day the shelter asked for one more thing, and by answering it, we found ourselves tied to the island a little tighter. I dug a drainage trench around the higher side so rainwater would run off instead of pooling under our platform. Lydia built shelves from the least warped boards I had saved, narrow little things, but square and useful. She lined jars there, set the coffee tin beside the flour, hung the kettle from a peg, and folded our blankets with such care that the place began to look less like a camp and more like an argument against defeat. We patched the reed walls twice. We packed clay into the floor edge. We learned where the wind entered, where damp gathered, where the sun struck hardest after noon. The boat hull kept its curve, the frame held. The island, which at first seemed intent on swallowing us, slowly gave up enough ground to stand on. The heat came next. Not the clean heat of open fields, but swamp heat, close and wet, and full of insect noise. It spoiled food if a thing sat idle for half a day. Salt pork turned shiny, meal clumped in the sack, flies found everything. Lydia answered that trouble before I had properly named it. She chose the shadiest side under a cedar and showed me where to dig only a shallow pit, because deeper down the ground turned sour and slick. We cribbed the sides with split boards, roofed it with planks, moss, and sod, and made ourselves a cool box, half cellar, half stubborn wish. It was enough. Potatoes kept. The pork lasted longer. Butter, when we had any by trade, survived a day or two instead of one meal. I made hooks from bent nails for hanging things high. Lydia sewed cloth covers for jars and called the flies thieves to their faces. At dusk, we sat in our doorway under a hanging scrap of net and listened to frogs call through the channels while the whole marsh steamed silver in the last light. By then, we had begun to know the island instead of merely endure. I could tell by the smell when rain was climbing in from the south channels. Lydia knew which patches of ground stayed firmest after a storm. She found mint growing wild in a wet corner and transplanted it beside the shelter. She saved ashes for lye, grease for soap, twine too short for any sane person to value, and seed as if each one were a coin. We traded with a trapper now and then, fish hooks for meal, labor for salt, once a pane of old glass for 2 days helping mend his landing. That pane went into our south wall, and when the sun came through it, the light fell warm and golden across Lydia's shelves. I cannot explain how much that little square of brightness changed the room. It made morning seem invited. It made our patched shelter feel chosen. I built a door after that, rough and heavy, but hung true. Lydia stitched a curtain from flour sacking. We planted beans in raised ridges of brought soil and marsh compost. Most failed. A few lived. The few tasted better than any feast I remembered from town. Then came the second great storm, the one that would have sent us running if our first season had not already taught us what to trust. All afternoon, the air lay still as held breath. The birds vanished. Even the insects seemed to fall quiet. I went around the shelter tightening lashings, driving wedges, checking the pitch seams with my thumb. Lydia brought everything loose inside, tied down the rainboard, covered the food pit, and said very little. We had become better at fear by then. We spent less time talking about it. When the storm struck after dark, it struck with full conviction. Wind shoved at the hull so hard the braces cried out. Rain came sideways through the reeds and rattled the boat roof like gravel. Water crept under the threshold. I stood with one shoulder to a post for an hour, maybe more, while Lydia bailed with the kettle and cursed the marsh, the sky, and my poor first frame in one steady. I thought once the west brace would go. It bent. It held. Near midnight, there was a cracking sound somewhere outside, and I knew at once the old shed had finally come down for good. Yet our roof stayed over us, our shelves stood, our door kept swinging on its hinges. We were frightened, yes, but we were not helpless, and that was a different kind of night altogether. In the morning, the island looked flayed open. The shed lay flat. Branches were down along the channel. One of our bean ridges had washed half away. But the house, because by then I had started calling it that in my own mind, was still there. Lydia came out barefoot into the wet grass, hair loose down her back, and laid her hand on the hull as if thanking a living thing. I stood beside her and understood at last what bankruptcy had failed to teach me in town. Losing money had not ruined us. Depending on money to tell us whether we still had a future had nearly done that. Here, with mud on my boots, pitch in the seams, and my wife already planning what to mend first, I saw that the island had given us something the river town never had. Every board, every shelf, every drop of caught rain, every meal wrestled from heat and damp, belonged to our labor and our learning. Nothing here had been handed over a counter. Nothing could be recalled by a creditor. We had come out to the marsh to disappear. Instead, under that turned boat and among those back channels, we had finally begun to appear as ourselves.